My 33rd birthday fell on a Tuesday, which meant the Anderson family gathering happened the following Saturday at my parents' house in suburban Denver. Same dining room where I'd blown out candles for 3 decades. Same relatives asking the same polite questions about my career. Same underlying tension about whether I'd ever amount to anything worthwhile. Growing up as the middle child between my sister Rebecca's medical school achievements and my younger brother Jason's law degree from Columbia had taught me early that academic success in the Anderson family was measured by prestige, not passion. Rebecca was finishing her cardiology residency at Johns Hopkins. Jason had just made partner at a White Shoe Manhattan law firm. And I was Dr. Sarah Anderson, molecular biologist, whose research into cellular aging mechanisms apparently didn't qualify as a real career. Sarah's still at the university, Mom would explain to distant relatives, using the tone people reserved for discussing chronic illnesses. Research. Very specialized. Dad was more direct. As a successful orthopedic surgeon who'd built a thriving private practice, he measured professional worth in terms of patient outcomes and annual income. My work studying telomere degradation in stem cells was, in his view, academic masturbation that contributed nothing meaningful to the world. "When are you going to get a real job?" became his standard greeting after I finished my postdoc at Stanford 5 years ago. "One that actually helps people?" The question stung because I genuinely believed my research could help people, potentially millions of them. For 8 years I'd been investigating why certain stem cell populations seemed immune to the cellular aging process that limited most tissue regeneration. My hypothesis was that understanding this mechanism could lead to treatments for age-related diseases, maybe even interventions that could extend healthy human lifespan. But trying to explain the clinical implications of telomerase activation pathways to family members who viewed anything outside their own expertise as irrelevant was like describing symphony music to people who'd gone voluntarily deaf. "Sarah's working on something with cells," Mom would tell dinner party guests, waving her hand vaguely. "Very complicated. Rebecca's saving actual hearts, though. She performed 3 surgeries this week." The comparison was constant and brutal. Rebecca's work was concrete, immediate, life-saving. She could describe her day in terms that anyone could understand. Blocked arteries cleared, heart rhythms restored, patients walking out of the hospital. My work involved cell cultures, microscopic imaging, and statistical analysis of molecular processes that took months to yield meaningful data. Jason wasn't much better. His legal victories were public, measurable, reported in newspapers. He won cases, negotiated deals, made headlines. My victories were papers published in journals that most people had never heard of, read by maybe 200 specialists worldwide. 20 papers in 8 years, Dad had said during last year's birthday dinner, as if he were announcing a terminal diagnosis. "How many people have you actually helped?" "Rebecca saved a dozen lives just this week." I tried explaining that basic research was the foundation for all medical advances, that understanding cellular mechanisms today would lead to treatments tomorrow, that some of the most important discoveries in history had taken decades to reach practical application. But Dad's attention would drift after the first few sentences, and the conversation would inevitably return to Rebecca's latest surgery or Jason's most recent courtroom triumph. The worst part was that they weren't wrong about the practical impact of my work. 8 years of research had produced exactly 0 treatments, 0 therapies, 0 interventions that had improved anyone's life in any measurable way. I had theories, hypotheses, preliminary data, and a growing collection of peer-reviewed publications that impressed my colleagues and meant nothing to my family. This year's birthday dinner followed the familiar script. Rebecca flew in from Baltimore with stories about a complex heart transplant she'd assisted with the previous week. Jason joined us via video call from his Manhattan office, where he was preparing for a corporate merger that would make national news. And I sat at the same chair I'd occupied since childhood, listening to my siblings describe their latest accomplishments while mentally rehearsing how I'd explain my recent grant rejection from the National Institutes of Health. "So, Sarah," Aunt Linda asked during the appetizer course, "how's your research going?" "Still working with those molecules." "Cells," I corrected gently. "I study stem cell aging mechanisms. Specifically, how certain stem cell populations maintain telomere length despite repeated division cycles." The familiar glassy-eyed look appeared on Aunt Linda's face. "That's nice, dear. Very scientific." Dad set down his wine glass with the slight thump that usually preceded his annual assessment of my career trajectory. I could feel the familiar tightness in my stomach as he cleared his throat and looked at me with the expression he typically reserved for delivering bad news to patients. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about something," he began, using his serious doctor voice. "You're 33 years old. You've been working on this research for how long now?" 8 years. 9 years if you count my graduate work, I said, knowing this would make his point stronger rather than weaker. 9 years. And in all that time you've published. He paused, as if trying to remember the exact number from our previous conversations about my professional failures. 27 papers in peer-reviewed journals, I said quietly. Including 3 in Cell and 1 in Science. Right. Papers. But Sarah, here's what I don't understand. Rebecca performs surgery on real patients with real problems. She fixes hearts, saves lives, makes a tangible difference every single day. Jason wins cases that affect actual companies, real people, meaningful outcomes. But your papers, who reads them? What do they accomplish? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone at the table was looking at me with expressions ranging from sympathetic curiosity to outright pity. Even Jason, attending virtually from his office, had stopped checking his phone to watch my response. "Dad," I said carefully, "basic research is the foundation for all medical advances. The treatments Rebecca uses, the surgical techniques, the medications, they all started with someone doing basic research into cellular mechanisms." "But when?" Dad pressed. "When does your research turn into something that actually helps people? You've been saying, someday, for 9 years. Rebecca started helping people on day 1 of her residency." I felt the familiar frustration rising in my throat. How do you explain to someone that breakthrough discoveries often take decades? That most basic research never leads to practical applications, but the few studies that do revolutionize everything? That understanding biological mechanisms is valuable in itself, even if the clinical applications aren't immediately obvious? "You'll never publish anything significant," Dad announced, leaning back in his chair with the finality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. 20 years of experiments, failed experiments, and what do you have to show for it? Rebecca saves lives. Jason wins cases. You write papers that sit in libraries collecting dust. The words hit like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel. Dad genuinely believed he was being helpful, pointing out hard truths that would motivate me to make better career choices. But because they echoed the doubts that kept me awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was wasting my life chasing discoveries that would never matter to anyone except a handful of academic colleagues. "Honey," Mom added in her most soothing voice, "your father just wants you to be successful. Maybe it's time to consider medical school? You could still become a doctor like Rebecca. Or law school," Jason suggested from the computer screen. "Your analytical skills would transfer well to legal research. I could help you get into Columbia." Everyone nodded along as if they were planning an intervention to save me from my own poor judgment. The birthday girl whose life choices had become the family's greatest disappointment. 20 years of failed experiments, Dad repeated, warming to his theme. "At what point do you admit that this isn't working?" I looked around the table at the faces of people who loved me but fundamentally didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. Rebecca with her cardiology residency and measurable patient outcomes. Jason with his partnership track and headline-making legal victories. Mom and Dad with their concrete definitions of success based on income and social status. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob with their polite confusion about what exactly I did all day in my laboratory. Everyone agreed sympathetically with Dad's assessment. Nods around the table. Concerned murmurs about my career prospects. Gentle suggestions about more practical alternatives that would provide financial security and social recognition. I took a sip of wine and set the glass down carefully, considering my response. "Time will tell," I said simply. Because what else could I say? That I was 6 weeks away from publishing research that would fundamentally change how the medical community understood cellular aging? That the data I'd been collecting for 18 months suggested a mechanism that could potentially extend healthy human lifespan by decades? That 3 major pharmaceutical companies had already reached out about licensing opportunities based on preliminary results I'd presented at a closed-door symposium? I couldn't say any of that because the final peer review process wasn't complete. Because Nature magazine's editorial board was still evaluating whether my research met their standards for publication. Because in science, nothing is real until it's published in a prestigious journal and validated by the broader research community. So I smiled politely and let the conversation drift to safer topics. Rebecca's upcoming conference presentation, Jason's vacation plans, the new restaurant that had opened downtown. We sang "Happy Birthday" around a chocolate cake Mom had ordered from my favorite bakery. Everyone gave thoughtful gifts and warm hugs and promises to stay in better touch. And I went home to my apartment thinking about the email I'd received 3 days earlier from Dr. Margaret Chin, senior editor at Nature, informing me that the final reviewer comments on my paper were overwhelmingly positive and that I should expect publication decisions within 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned out to be exactly 10 days. I was sitting in my laboratory on the following Tuesday afternoon, analyzing protein expression data from my latest batch of stem cell cultures, when my phone rang with a number I'd been hoping to see. Dr. Anderson, this is Dr. Margaret Chin from Nature magazine. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. Not at all, Dr. Chin. Thank you for calling. I have excellent news about your submission. The editorial board has voted unanimously to publish your paper on stem cell telomere maintenance mechanisms. More than that, we'd like to feature your research as this month's cover story. I closed my eyes and felt 9 years of work crystallize into this single moment. Nature magazine cover story. The most prestigious publication in all of science, read by researchers in every field, the journal that published Darwin's evolutionary theory and Watson and Crick's DNA structure. Dr. Anderson? Are you there? I'm here. I'm just processing this news. I understand completely. Your research represents a fundamental breakthrough in our understanding of cellular aging. The implications for regenerative medicine and longevity research are staggering. Our editorial team is calling it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. I thanked Dr. Chin and hung up the phone, then sat in my laboratory chair staring at cell culture dishes while the reality of the situation settled over me. In less than a week, researchers around the world would be reading about my discovery. Pharmaceutical companies would be calling with licensing offers. Medical schools would be inviting me to give lectures. The research that Dad had dismissed as failed experiments would be recognized as groundbreaking science. But first, I had a birthday celebration to conclude. I drove back to my parents' house, where the family was still gathered around the dining room table, picking at leftover cake and continuing the conversation about my uncertain career prospects. "Sarah," Mom exclaimed as I walked back through the front door. "Did you forget something?" "Actually, I wanted to share some news," I said, pulling out my phone as it rang again with Dr. Chen's number. "This is the call I've been waiting for." Dad looked up from his conversation with Uncle Bob about golf handicaps. "What call?" I put the phone on speaker and answered. "Dr. Anderson, this is Margaret Chin from Nature again. I apologize for calling back so quickly, but our media relations team wants to coordinate the press release for your cover story. The New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN have already submitted interview requests based on the preliminary announcement." The dining room fell completely silent. Dad's fork stopped halfway between the cake plate and his mouth. Rebecca, who had been describing her latest surgical technique to Aunt Linda, turned to stare at me with wide eyes. "Press release," Mom whispered. "Yes," Dr. Chen's voice continued through the speakerphone. "Dr. Anderson's breakthrough in stem cell aging mechanisms is being hailed as a potential game-changer for regenerative medicine. We're expecting significant media coverage when the issue publishes next week." Dad set down his fork with a hand that was visibly trembling. "Margaret, could you explain what exactly Sarah discovered?" "Dr. Anderson has identified the molecular mechanism that allows certain stem cell populations to maintain telomere length indefinitely, essentially making them immune to cellular aging. The implications for treating age-related diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, are extraordinary. This could be the foundation for therapies that extend healthy human lifespan by decades." The birthday cake sat forgotten on the table as everyone stared at me like I'd suddenly revealed the ability to fly. "Dr. Anderson," Dr. Chin continued, "Harvard Medical School has already called requesting your availability for a faculty position. The Broad Institute wants to discuss establishing a new research center around your work. And I should mention that Regeneron, Genentech, and Johnson & Johnson have submitted preliminary licensing inquiries through our legal department." I thanked Dr. Chin and ended the call, then looked around the table at family members who were seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time in 9 years. "Sarah," Dad said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're going to be on the cover of Nature magazine?" "Next month's issue," I confirmed, sitting back down at the table and reaching for my abandoned piece of cake. The editorial board called it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. "Your failed experiments," Rebecca said, staring at me with something that looked like awe, "are going to change medicine?" "That's what the peer reviewers concluded," I said, taking a bite of chocolate cake as if I weren't describing research that would reshape how the medical community understood human aging. Jason's face filled the computer screen, his earlier distraction replaced by intense focus. "Sarah, when you say licensing inquiries from pharmaceutical companies, I mean that the 3 largest biotech companies in the world want to discuss turning my research into actual therapies that could treat age-related diseases," I said. "Early projections suggest potential applications worth tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue." Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then seemed to forget how speech worked entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from my department chair. "CNN wants to interview you tomorrow morning. New York Times science reporter is flying in tonight. Harvard called offering full professor with tenure." I showed the text to Dad, who read it twice before handing my phone back with shaking hands. "Sarah," Mom said, reaching across the table to touch my hand, "why didn't you tell us how important your research was?" I considered the question carefully. I tried to explain it many times. "But you couldn't see the significance until Nature magazine validated it for you." The admission hung in the air like incense. For 9 years I'd been describing my work to family members who measured success in terms of immediate, tangible outcomes. They couldn't understand that some of the most important discoveries in human history had emerged from basic research that seemed irrelevant to practical concerns. "We thought," Dad said slowly, "that you were just playing around in laboratories." "I was playing around in laboratories," I agreed. "That's how scientific breakthroughs happen. You experiment with cellular mechanisms until you discover something that changes everything." My phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, director of the National Institute on Aging. "Dr. Anderson, I hope you're prepared for what's about to happen. Your Nature paper is going to make you the most famous aging researcher in the world overnight. We'd like to discuss a 10-year research grant that could fund the largest longevity study in human history." After hanging up, I noticed that everyone at the table was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked suspiciously like reverence. "The most famous aging researcher in the world," Aunt Linda repeated slowly. "Apparently," I said, finishing my birthday cake while my family processed the reality that the person they'd seen as the professional disappointment had just achieved the kind of scientific recognition that most researchers only dream about. Dad cleared his throat. "Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "For what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For not believing in you. For not understanding that what you were doing was important. For suggesting that 20 years of research was a waste of time." 9 years, I corrected gently. "But I understand why you couldn't see the significance. Cellular aging mechanisms aren't exactly dinner table conversation." "But we're not strangers," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're your family. We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing. You should have asked better questions about my research instead of assuming it was irrelevant," I agreed. "But I also understand why you didn't. What I do is pretty abstract until it results in something like this." Over the next 2 weeks, my life transformed completely. The Nature paper generated more media coverage than any scientific publication I'd ever seen. CNN, BBC, NPR, and 60 other news outlets ran features about the breakthrough that could extend human lifespan. Harvard offered me a full professorship with a starting salary higher than Dad's surgical income. Pharmaceutical companies submitted licensing bids totaling over $2 billion for the rights to develop therapies based on my research. My family, meanwhile, became my biggest advocates. Dad started telling his golf buddies about his daughter, the genius scientist whose research will cure aging. Mom carried copies of the Nature issue in her purse to show anyone who would look. Rebecca called me for advice about incorporating longevity research into her cardiology practice. Jason offered to help negotiate the pharmaceutical licensing deals. The birthday dinner that was supposed to be another intervention about my career choices became the moment when my family finally understood that some achievements can't be measured in traditional terms until they reach a level of recognition that makes their importance undeniable. I used part of the initial licensing revenue to establish the Anderson Institute for Cellular Aging Research, providing funding for graduate students whose work is too experimental for traditional grant agencies. Students like I had been working on projects that their own families might not understand until the breakthrough moment arrives. The research that Dad dismissed as 20 years of failed experiments turned out to be 9 years of foundational work leading to discoveries that could potentially extend healthy human lifespan by decades. Sometimes the most important contributions to human knowledge come from people working on problems that seem irrelevant to practical concerns, in pursuit of understanding that takes years or decades to yield applications. Sometimes playing around in laboratories is the most serious work of all. And sometimes time does tell exactly as promised.